He married her to punish her family, humiliate her in public, and destroy everything her father had built. But the biggest mistake the billionaire ever made was expecting her to break before he did. The day Adrian Cole married me, he looked like a man attending a business merger. Not a wedding, no smile, no softness, no love, just a sharp black suit, a cold face, and a promise in his eyes that made my stomach turn before the pastor even said a word. People in the church thought I was the lucky one. That was the funny part to them. I was the girl who had somehow won the heart of one of the youngest billionaires in the city. The same Adrian Cole women chased, blogs gossiped about, and society mothers prayed over for their daughters. Tall, handsome, powerful, ruthless. The kind of man whose name opened doors before he even entered the room. But I knew the truth. Adrian did not marry me because he loved me. He married me because he hated my father. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Elena Brooks. I was 26, jobless and one rent warning away from complete disgrace when Adrian Cole walked back into my life. My father had once been a very powerful man in construction and government contracts. He was proud, loud, controlling, and obsessed with appearances. The kind of man who could shake your hand in public and destroy you in private. Growing up under him felt like living inside a polished prison. Everything had to look good, nothing had to feel good. By the time I became an adult, I had already learned one important thing. My father loved power more than people. What I didn't know then was that Adrian Cole had learned the same lesson the hard way. Years earlier, Adrian's father had been ruined in a business scandal. Their family name was dragged through the mud. Their company collapsed, and his father died not long after. People said it was stress, people said it was shame. People said many things, but one rumor survived every version of the story. My father had played a major role in that man's downfall. I never knew how true it was. My father denied everything. Of course, men like him always do. But Adrian believed it, and Adrian built his entire life around revenge. By the time he returned to the city, he was no longer the quiet son of a broken man. He was rich, feared, and impossible to ignore. He bought companies the way other people bought lunch. He destroyed competitors with one meeting. He had money, influence, and the kind of cold discipline that made people nervous around him. Then he came for my father, not with fists, not with shouting, with strategy. My father's business was already slipping when Adrian started circling it. Contracts disappeared, investors pulled back, lawsuits appeared from nowhere, deals collapsed overnight. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in my father's eyes. Real fear. Then one evening, he called me into his study and said the words that changed my life. Adrian Cole wants to marry you. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was insane. My father stood by the window, refusing to look at me directly. He made it clear, if this marriage happens, he backs off. I stared at him, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. It didn't. You want to trade me for your company? His jaw tightened. Mind your tone. That answer told me everything. I should have walked out. I should have refused. I should have burned that house down with my silence and left him to drown in his own mess. But life was not that simple. My younger sister was still in school. My mother had spent years shrinking herself inside that marriage until she looked more like a ghost than a woman. And despite everything, part of me still believed I could stop my family from completely collapsing. So I agreed to meet Adrian. That was mistake number one. He received me in a glass-walled office on the top floor of one of his company buildings. The city glittered behind him like it belonged to him too. He didn't offer me water, didn't ask how I was, didn't pretend this was romance. He just looked at me with those cold, unreadable eyes and said, "You came." I sat down slowly. "You asked for me." "No," he said, "I asked for marriage." The room went still. There was something terrifying about how calm he was. No drama, no raised voice, just control. "Why me?" I asked, though I already knew. His mouth barely moved. "Because your father values ownership. I want him to feel what it means to lose it." That sentence should have sent me running. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning my chest since I walked in. "And what exactly am I supposed to be in all this?" He leaned back in his chair and held my gaze. "My wife," he said, "publicly, legally, strategically," almost laughed again. But this time it came out as anger. "So that's it, you marry me, hurt my father." And everybody claps. His expression did not change. "I marry you," he said calmly, "and your father learns that power can be taken. Then he added the line I never forgot. "You can hate me if you want, Elena. I am not asking for your heart." And somehow, that was the most dangerous thing he could have said. Because people who don't ask for your heart have a way of stealing it when you're busy protecting it. I should have said no, I know that now. But at the time, saying no felt like throwing my mother and sister into a fire I could still stop. My father was already drowning, and for the first time in his life, he was desperate enough to use me as a life jacket. I hated him for it. I hated Adrian for offering it. And somehow, I hated myself most for sitting in that office and still asking, if I agree, what happens next? Adrian didn't blink. Your father signs over the remaining disputed assets. I stop the final takeover. The wedding happens quickly. Publicly, cleanly. I repeated, you call this clean? His jaw shifted slightly, but his voice stayed calm. Cleaner than what comes next if he refuses. That was the thing about Adrian. He never shouted, he didn't need to. Every sentence sounded like a closed door. I told him I needed time. He gave me 48 hours. When I got home, my father was pacing like a man waiting for a hospital result. The moment he saw my face, he asked, "What did he say? Not, are you okay? Not, did he threaten you? Not even, do you want this, just business?" I looked at him and something inside me went cold. You really mean to do this? He exhaled hard. Elena, this is bigger than your emotions. I laughed in disbelief. Of course it is. Everything is. My mother said nothing through that entire conversation. She just sat on the edge of the sofa, fingers locked together, eyes tired in that old familiar way. My sister avoided looking at me at all. The whole house felt rotten, like everybody knew we had crossed into something shameful and no one had the courage to name it. That night, my mother came into my room after midnight. She closed the door softly and stood there for a moment like she had forgotten how to begin. "You don't have to save us," she said. I looked at her and almost cried, because it was the first honest thing anyone had said all day. "Then why didn't you say that downstairs?" Her eyes dropped because in this house, surviving and speaking have never been the same thing. That line stayed with me the next morning. I went back to Adrian's office and agreed. He didn't smile, didn't look pleased. He just nodded once like we had finalized a contract. Then he slid a folder toward me. Inside was a prenuptial agreement, press strategy, wedding schedule, housing arrangement, and a list of public appearances already planned for us after the ceremony. He had prepared everything before I even answered. That should have terrified me more than it did. "You really thought I'd say yes?" I said. He looked at me steadily. "I thought your father would corner you until you had to." That answer hit harder than if he had insulted me. Because he was right, the wedding was arranged in less than 3 weeks. Society pages went wild, headlines called it shocking, romantic, unexpected. People said I was lucky. Some said I had been secretly dating him for months. Others said I had always been more ambitious than I looked. Nobody knew the truth, and the truth was ugly enough to choke on. The first time I saw my wedding dress, I wanted to throw it back at the stylist. It was beautiful, elegant, and expensive in a way that made me feel even more trapped. Everything about the wedding was designed to look like love. That was Adrian's genius. He wasn't just punishing my father. He was doing it beautifully. The night before the ceremony, he called me not to comfort me, not to check on me, just one short call. "Be on time tomorrow." I gripped the phone harder. "That's all you have to say to me." A pause, then in that low, controlled voice, he said, "No matter what this started as, I won't allow anyone to disrespect you publicly. Remember that." And just like that, he hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time after that, because that was the first crack in him. Small but real. A man marrying me for revenge should not have cared whether I was protected. A man using me should not have sounded almost angry at the idea of anyone humiliating me. But Adrian did, and that confused me more than cruelty would have. By the next afternoon, I was walking down the aisle toward the man who wanted to destroy my father and had chosen me as the weapon. He looked perfect, tall, cold, unreadable, the kind of man every woman in that church would have married willingly. When I reached him, he held my gaze for one long second, then took my hand. His palm was warm. That tiny detail disturbed me more than anything else, because revenge was supposed to feel cold, and somehow, standing beside him, it didn't. Marrying Adrian did not feel like becoming a wife. It felt like stepping into a role someone else had written for me without asking if I could survive the ending. The wedding was flawless, the photos were perfect, and the guests wore the exact expressions I expected: envy, curiosity, admiration to the world. I was the woman who had won a billionaire. To myself, I was still trying to understand how I had become part of a revenge plan dressed up as romance. After the ceremony, Adrian took me to the penthouse that would now be my home. It sat above the city like a kingdom made of glass and silence. Everything inside screamed wealth: marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, art that probably cost more than my father's first company, and a bedroom so elegant it felt impersonal. Nothing in that place looked lived in. It looked arranged, controlled, protected from chaos, just like him. He showed me around with the calm efficiency of a man onboarding a business partner. My room was no longer my room. Everything was ours now, though nothing about it felt shared. When he finally stopped in the living area, he turned to me and said, "You are free to use anything in this house. Staff will answer to you publicly. We behave as a married couple. Privately, you will not be forced into anything you do not want." That last part caught me off guard. I looked at him. "You mean that?" His eyes held mine. Yes, it was the first time since all this began that I felt something close to relief. He had trapped me, yes, he had used me. Yes, but he wasn't a monster in the simplest sense. And somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. Cruel men are easier to hate. Complicated men find cracks in your anger. The first week of marriage was strange. Adrian left early, came home late, and spoke to me only when necessary. But he never ignored me in front of others. At dinners, he pulled out my chair. At events, he stood close enough to make the cameras happy. If reporters asked us questions, he answered smoothly, always protecting the story we were selling. He had created a perfect public marriage in record time, and I hated how convincing we looked together. The problem was that private life began to ruin my hatred. He noticed things quietly, without performance. He realized I hated sleeping with bright curtains open, and the next evening the staff replaced them with softer ones. He overheard me asking the cook for tea the way my mother used to make it, and the next morning it appeared at breakfast without explanation. When one of his business associates made a slick comment at dinner about me marrying very well, Adrian's expression changed so fast the whole table went silent. He said calmly, "My wife doesn't need your commentary." No one spoke after that. That should not have mattered to me. But it did. The first real shift happened 10 days after the wedding. I had gone downstairs late at night because I couldn't sleep, and I found Adrian in the kitchen, barefoot, standing in the dark with only the refrigerator light falling across his face. For a man who looked untouchable in public, he suddenly looked almost human there. Tired, distant, alone. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You can't sleep either?" he asked. I leaned against the counter. "Did you just say something almost normal?" That earned the smallest reaction from him. Not a smile exactly, but close. Then he surprised me again. "You're different at night." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "You stop pretending not to have opinions." I should have been offended, but instead I laughed. A real laugh. The sound startled both of us. For a second the room changed. No revenge. No contract marriage. No dead fathers and ruined companies. Just a man and a woman standing in a dark kitchen at an absurd hour, talking like neither of them knew what to do with the quiet. Then he asked, "Do you want to know the truth?" My heartbeat shifted. "About what?" "Why I really chose you." I held his gaze and nodded. He looked down for a moment, then back at me. "At first it was strategy. I wanted your father cornered, and I knew you were the one person he would sacrifice to save himself." His voice stayed steady, but there was something rougher underneath now. "But when I met you, I realized something else. You were nothing like him." That should have comforted me. Instead, it unsettled me. "That's supposed to make this better." "No," he said quietly, "it makes it worse." That was the moment I knew he was no longer fully in control of this marriage either. And that terrified me, because revenge was one thing, but revenge turning into something softer, stranger, and more real. That was how people got hurt in ways they never saw coming. After that night in the kitchen, something changed between us, and pretending otherwise became exhausting. It wasn't sudden. Adrian did not wake up warm, and I did not wake up trusting him. But the distance we had both been protecting started to crack in quiet, dangerous ways. We spoke more. Sometimes at breakfast, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the car on the way to events where we had to perform our perfect marriage for cameras and strangers. And the more we spoke, the more I realized the man I had married for revenge was not as untouched as he wanted the world to believe. He was disciplined, yes, cold when necessary, sharp enough to make powerful men nervous. But underneath all that, Adrian carried anger like an old wound that had never healed properly. It was not only about his father. It was about humiliation, powerlessness, and the kind of grief that turns into ambition because pain needs somewhere to go. One evening, after a charity dinner, we came home later than usual. I kicked off my heels the second we entered the penthouse and muttered that whoever invented public appearances deserved jail time. To my surprise, Adrian laughed, a real laugh, low, brief, but real enough to stop me in my tracks. I turned to stare at him. "You can laugh." That faint expression stayed at the corner of his mouth. Rarely, well, that was unsettling. He loosened his tie and looked at me with a softness that made the air between us feel too thin. "You were very convincing tonight." I raised a brow. "As your fake wife." "As my wife," he said. The words landed heavily. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I looked away first, because something in his voice had made my chest tighten, and I did not want him to see that. But the real shift came a few days later when my father showed up uninvited. He arrived at the penthouse in expensive shame, wearing a suit that looked more desperate than powerful. Adrian had him sent into the private lounge, and I made the mistake of stepping into the room too. The moment my father saw me, his face changed. Not with concern, with calculation. "Elena," he said, "I need a word with you." Adrian remained standing. "You can speak in front of me." My father's mouth hardened. "This is family business." Adrian's voice stayed calm. "That's exactly why I should hear it." I knew then that something ugly was coming. My father turned to me and lowered his tone, as if softness could still fool me. He said the company was collapsing faster than expected. Creditors were circling, and Adrian had not honored the full spirit of their agreement. I almost laughed in his face. Even now, he was talking as if I had been part of a transaction and should help him renegotiate the price. Then he said the one thing that snapped whatever patience I had left. "You need to remember why you married him in the first place." The room went still. Adrian's expression changed first. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. My father had just admitted the truth out loud in the middle of Adrian's home, as if I were still something to be used and moved around. I looked at my father and felt years of buried anger rise at once. "No," I said, "you need to remember why I married him. Because you were willing to sell me to save yourself." He flinched, but only with pride. "Elena, don't be emotional," that old sentence, the one men use when they want your silence to sound unreasonable. Before I could answer, Adrian stepped in. His voice was low and lethal. "You should leave." My father looked at him with open resentment. "This is between me and my daughter." Adrian did not move. "No, this is a man standing in my home trying to use my wife again." My wife, there was something different in the way he said it this time. Not strategic, not performative. Protective. My father saw it too. He looked between us, and for the first time, I think he understood what was happening. This was no longer just revenge. Something had shifted, and he had lost control of it. He left angry, humiliated, and muttering threats that no longer frightened me the way they once did. When the door shut behind him, the penthouse went quiet. I was still shaking, but not from fear. Adrian came closer and asked if I was all right. I tried to answer, but instead I started crying. The kind of furious tears that come when pain and relief hit at the same time. And Adrian, the man who had married me for revenge, did the one thing I never expected. He pulled me into his arms, not carefully, not politely, just instinctively, like letting me stand there alone had become impossible for him. That was the moment everything changed. Because I should have pushed him away, instead I held on. The first time Adrian touched me like he actually cared, I knew everything had changed, not because he kissed me. He didn't, not because he suddenly became soft and romantic. He didn't, it changed because, after my father left that penthouse humiliated and angry, Adrian looked at me like I was no longer part of his revenge. He looked at me like I was someone he wanted to protect. And that was far more dangerous. 4 days after that confrontation, the air between us felt different. We still moved carefully around each other, but the distance was gone now. He came home earlier, we had dinner together more often. Sometimes we talked about small things, sometimes about nothing important at all. Yet those moments somehow felt more intimate than all the public performances we had done as husband and wife. That was the strange thing about Adrian. In public, he knew exactly how to play the role of the powerful billionaire husband. But in private, when he relaxed just enough to become human, he was harder to resist. One evening, I was sitting by the window in the living room, watching the city lights blur under the rain, when he came in without his jacket and loosened his tie. "He looked tired, long day?" I asked. He glanced at me, almost surprised that I had spoken first. "You could say that," I hesitated, then asked, "Did you always plan to destroy my father completely?" He stood still for a moment, then he walked to the bar, poured a drink, and answered without looking at me. "Yes, honesty hit me hard." He turned back slowly. "When I first came back, revenge was the only thing that made sense to me. I thought if I ruined him, something in me would finally settle." "Did it?" His expression changed. "Just slightly." "No." That single word stayed in the room like a confession. I looked at him properly then, and for the first time, I did not just see the man who had trapped me. I saw the man who had been living inside his anger for so long that he no longer knew who he was without it. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I went into the kitchen for water and found him there again, standing in the half-dark like a man who didn't belong to his own silence. He looked at me and said, "You should be asleep." "You too." A small pause, then he surprised me. "I don't sleep well when I know you're upset." That made my heart stumble in a way I deeply resented. I folded my arms. "That sounds dangerously close to concern." He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe it is." We stood there in silence after that, and it felt too full, too alive, too real, so I asked the question I had been avoiding. "Why are you being different with me?" His eyes held mine. "I'm not being different." "Yes, you are." He set the glass down. Then, in that low, controlled voice of his, he said, "Because you are no longer just part of the plan." My breath caught. That was not a love confession. Not yet, but it was enough to shake everything I had been using to protect myself. The next morning, the scandal began. At first, it was only whispers on gossip blogs. Then social media picked it up. Then business pages. Then mainstream entertainment outlets. The story spread fast. Billionaire Adrian Cole had not married Elena Brooks for love, but as part of a calculated revenge plan against her father's failing empire. The world exploded. Some people called me a victim. Others called me a liar. Some said I must have known everything and agreed for money. Others said Adrian was ruthless, even for a billionaire. I sat in the penthouse staring at my phone, or my name burned across screens in rooms I would never enter. When Adrian came home and found me like that, his face changed immediately. He took the phone from my hand and said, "Stop reading it." I laughed bitterly. That would be easier if they weren't talking about my life. He looked furious, but not at me. "My team is handling it." I stared at him. Handling what exactly? The lies or the truth? That landed hard for a second. I thought he might shut down and retreat into that cold billionaire control of his. Instead he said quietly, "Both." I looked away before he could see how much that hurt. "Do you know what's humiliating?" I asked. "Not just that they're talking. It's that they're not entirely wrong." He came closer, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said. "You don't get to comfort me out of a fire you started." That hit him. I saw it, and yet he did not defend himself. That was the cruel part. He could have argued, could have blamed my father, could have justified himself, but he didn't. He just stood there, holding the full weight of what he had done. And somehow that made it harder to hate him, because by then, the truth I had been trying not to face was already alive between us. I was no longer only angry at Adrian. I was falling for him, and that was the real disaster. Falling for Adrian felt like betraying myself. That was the hardest part, not the scandal, not the gossip, not even the humiliation of seeing strangers argue over whether I was a victim, a gold digger, or a fool. The hardest part was realizing that somewhere between the forced wedding, the quiet dinners, and the man he became when nobody was watching, I had started loving the same person I had every reason to hate. For 2 days after the scandal broke, we barely spoke. Adrian gave me space, which somehow hurt more than if he had followed me around asking for forgiveness. He stayed busy with damage control, meetings, lawyers, and statements, while I stayed in the penthouse, trying not to drown in my own thoughts. Every room felt too polished, too quiet, too aware of me. On the third night, I found him in his study. He was sitting alone, jacket off, tie loosened, staring at a file without really reading it. For the first time since I had known him, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with regret. I stood at the door and said, "Did you ever plan to tell me the whole truth?" He looked up slowly. He said, "I almost laughed when, after I had defended you, after I had fallen in love with you, after I stopped being useful." Pain moved across his face so quickly that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. "You were never useful to me," he said quietly. "You were never a tool once I knew you." I folded my arms, trying to hold myself together. "That's not true. It started that way." "Yes," he said, "and that is the part I can never undo." The honesty in him was infuriating. It took away all the easy exits. I stepped farther into the room. "Then why didn't you stop it? Why keep pretending after things changed?" He stood up then, and the distance between us suddenly felt fragile. "Because I was a coward," he said. That shocked me more than anything else. Adrian Cole was not the kind of man people imagined saying words like that. He held my gaze and continued. "At first I told myself I was finishing what I started. Then I told myself I was protecting you from a mess I had already created. But the truth is, the deeper this became, the more ashamed I was, and the more I loved you, the more impossible it felt to confess that the foundation of all this was revenge." My throat tightened. There it was. Not polished, not strategic, not hidden behind money or power. Just love spoken like something that had cost him. I stared at him and asked the one question that had been torturing me since this all began. "If my father had not been my father, would you still have wanted me?" He answered so quickly it almost hurt. Yes, no hesitation. No thinking. Just yes. I looked away because tears were already rising. He came closer, slowly this time, giving me every chance to move if I wanted to. "I didn't, Elena," he said, softer now. "I know love does not erase what I did. I know regret does not rebuild trust overnight. But I love you not out of guilt, not out of habit, not because we are already married. I love you because somewhere in the middle of all this, you became the only honest thing in my life." I broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for tears to finally fall. And Adrian, the man who had once married me to wound my father, reached for me like hurting me now would destroy him too. When he pulled me into his arms, I let him, not because everything was fixed, not because I had forgotten, but because for the first time, his embrace did not feel like possession. It felt like truth. Outside, the scandal was still growing. Inside, my heart was already making the choice my pride was still trying to resist. And deep down, I knew the real ending of our story would not be decided by the world. It would be decided by whether I could forgive the man who had finally become everything he had once promised he would never be. The next morning, the world was still talking about us, but something inside me had gone quiet. Not peaceful, not healed, just quiet in that way life becomes quiet after a truth has finally been spoken aloud. Adrian loved me, and somehow, despite everything, I loved him too. That should have made things easier. It didn't. Love is not magic. It does not erase betrayal, shame, or the ugly way a story begins. But it does force you to stop lying to yourself. I spent most of that day thinking about the version of me who had walked down that wedding aisle. Angry, trapped, determined not to break. That woman would never have believed she could one day look at Adrian Cole and see something other than revenge in a tailored suit. Yet here I was. By evening, another storm hit. A major paper released leaked documents linking my father more directly to the scheme that ruined Adrian's father years ago. Not rumors this time, not whispers. Documents, signatures, transfers, meetings, enough truth to make denial useless. My father's name exploded across every platform. This time I did not feel shock. I felt grief, not because he was innocent. He wasn't, but because it was a terrible thing to see, in black and white, that the man who raised me had built so much of his life on manipulation and called it success. I found Adrian in the living room, reading the article in silence. He looked up when I entered, and for once there was no coldness in him. No strategy, no billionaire control. Just sorrow. "Father did it," I said quietly. Adrian set the paper aside. "Yes," I nodded slowly, tears already burning. "And he used me too." That line seemed to hit him harder than all the others. He stood and came toward me carefully, as if grief had made me fragile. "Elena," he said, "I am sorry for what he did to you. And I am sorry for what I did with that pain." I closed my eyes for a second. Then I asked him the question that mattered most now. If you could go back, would you still marry me that way? His answer came rough and immediate. No, I would still choose you. But not like that, never like that. I believed him. That was the moment I understood forgiveness was already happening inside me, even before I had found the courage to name it. Later that night, my father called. I stared at the phone for a long time before answering. His voice sounded weak, stripped of its usual arrogance. He said people were abandoning him. He said the press was destroying him. He said family should stand together in times like this. Family, the word almost made me laugh. I listened until he finished, then said, very calmly, you taught me that family can be sacrificed when power is at risk. You taught me that yourself. He went silent, then he tried one last time. Elena, I'm still your father. I held the phone tighter. I said, and that has cost me enough. Then I ended the call. When I turned around, Adrian was standing nearby. He hadn't interrupted, hadn't tried to take over. He just looked at me with quiet understanding, like he knew what it had taken for me to finally put that old fear down. I walked to him slowly. I don't know what happens next, I admitted. He touched my face gently, his voice low. Then we figure it out honestly this time. Honestly, that word meant more to me than love in that moment. So I nodded, and for the first time since this whole twisted story began, I kissed him without hesitation. Not because the past had disappeared, not because the pain had never happened, but because love had finally stopped hiding behind revenge. And Adrian, the billionaire who married me to destroy my father, became the man who chose to rebuild something real with me instead. The world said our marriage started as a scandal. Maybe it did, but it did not end there. It ended with truth. It ended with choice. And somehow, against every ugly beginning, it ended with love.